80 years ago, on March 15, 1945, Sergeant William "Billy" Matthews sent his final letter home to his wife Sarah in small-town Nebraska, writing, "Tomorrow we cross the Rhine. The war will be over soon, honey. Keep the home fires burning." He never made it across. His disappearance, along with 11 other American servicemen in a DUKW convoy, plunged their families into decades of anguish and unanswered questions, while military archives offered only silence and speculation. The case fell into official oblivion, but the families never stopped believing that one day the truth would surface from the depths of the Rhine. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell icon. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and proof. The morning of March 16, 1945, dawned grey and cold along the Rhine River near Remagen. The famous bridge had been captured days earlier, but Allied forces continued using amphibious crossings to establish multiple footholds on the eastern bank. Among the units preparing for transport was Convoy Delta 7, 3 DUKW vehicles loaded with ammunition, medical supplies, and 12 soldiers from the 89th Infantry Division. Staff Sergeant Matthews, at 24, was the convoy leader. His DUKW carried Private First Class James Rodriguez from Texas, who had been writing poetry about the war in a small leather journal. The second vehicle was commanded by Corporal Daniel O'Brien from Boston, with Privates Michael Thompson, Robert Chen, and David Williams aboard. The third DUKW was under Sergeant Frank Kowalski from Detroit, carrying Privates Joseph Miller, Anthony Ricci, Samuel Jackson, Thomas Anderson, and Charles Parker. The crossing was scheduled for 0800 hours. Radio contact established the convoy's departure from the western shore. Delta 7 moving into the water, Matthews reported to base command. Weather conditions acceptable, visibility fair. That transmission, logged at 0803 hours, would be the last anyone heard from the 12 men. By 0900 hours, when the convoy failed to report arrival on the eastern shore, search operations began. Patrol boats scanned the crossing zone, while aircraft flew reconnaissance missions over the river. The Rhine, swollen with spring snowmelt, carried debris and showed no obvious signs of the missing DUKWs. Radio operators attempted contact every 15 minutes, receiving only static in return. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, the division's operations officer, faced an impossible situation. 3 vehicles and 12 men had simply vanished in broad daylight during a routine river crossing. No enemy fire had been reported. No distress signals were received. The Rhine had apparently swallowed them whole, leaving no trace except the families who would spend the rest of their lives waiting for explanations that never came. The official incident report, filed 3 days later, listed the convoy as missing in action, presumed drowned. The families received telegrams expressing regret for their presumed loss, but offering no details about ongoing search efforts or recovery attempts. The war continued its relentless pace, and Convoy Delta 7 became another statistical entry in the massive casualty records of the European theatre. Sarah Matthews, pregnant with their first child, refused to accept the presumption of death. She wrote letter after letter to military authorities, congressional representatives, and the War Department, demanding answers about her husband's fate. Her son, born 3 months later and named William Jr., they would grow up hearing stories about a father who disappeared into the Rhine River, leaving behind only questions and a widow's unwavering faith that someday the truth would emerge. The telegram arrived at the Rodriguez family's modest home in San Antonio on March 22, 1945. Maria Rodriguez, James's mother, collapsed in her kitchen when she read the words "missing in action." Her son's poetry journal, which he had been filling since entering combat, was somewhere at the bottom of the Rhine, if the official story was true. 800 miles north, Daniel O'Brien's wife, Ellen, was nursing their 6-month-old daughter when 2 uniformed officers knocked on her door in South Boston. The Irish-American community rallied around the young widow, but their support couldn't fill the void left by unanswered questions. Where exactly had her husband's DUKW gone down? Why were no bodies recovered? Why had the search been called off so quickly? In Detroit, Frank Kowalski's parents, Polish immigrants who had sacrificed everything to give their son opportunities in America, found themselves navigating military bureaucracy in a language that still felt foreign. Their questions were met with form letters expressing sympathy, but offering no substantive information about the circumstances surrounding their son's disappearance. The pattern repeated across America. 12 families, scattered from Nebraska to California, found themselves united by grief and frustration. Official channels provided no comfort, only standardized responses, acknowledging their loss, while offering no details about recovery efforts or ongoing investigations. Mrs. Helen Thompson, Michael's mother from rural Iowa, began corresponding with other families affected by similar wartime disappearances. Her kitchen table became an informal headquarters for what would become a decades-long quest for answers. She meticulously documented every piece of correspondence with military officials, creating files that would eventually span multiple cardboard boxes stored in her attic. The families formed an unofficial support network, sharing information and strategies for pressing military authorities. They discovered that convoy disappearances were not uncommon during river crossings, but the complete absence of debris or bodies from Delta 7 was unusual. Most DUKW losses resulted in at least some recoverable evidence, life jackets, equipment, or human remains washing ashore downstream. By 1947, as the immediate post-war period gave way to new international tensions, the families realized that official interest in their case had evaporated. The military was focused on occupation duties and emerging Cold War concerns. 12 missing soldiers from a 1945 Rhine crossing had become historical footnotes, their disappearance filed away in archives that few would ever access. Sarah Matthews remarried in 1952, but she never stopped using her first husband's name when corresponding with military authorities. Her son William Jr. grew up knowing that his father was missing, not dead, a distinction that would shape his entire worldview. He learned to live with uncertainty, but also with hope that someday the Rhine would give up its secrets. The children of the missing soldiers formed their own informal network as they reached adulthood. They shared a unique bond, the experience of growing up with fathers who existed only in photographs, letters, and their mothers' stories. They inherited not just grief, but also determination to solve a mystery that had consumed their families for decades. As the 1960s brought social upheaval and questioning of authority, some family members began demanding more aggressive action. They organized letter-writing campaigns, contacted journalists, and sought assistance from newly elected congressmen who campaigned on transparency and veterans' issues. But military records remained sealed, and official responses continued to cite national security concerns and the passage of time as barriers to further investigation. Through the 1970s and 1980s, the families of Convoy Delta 7 watched as other wartime mysteries received public attention and government resources. The Vietnam War's missing soldiers became a national cause, with extensive search and recovery operations funded by Congress. But World War II cases like theirs remained locked in bureaucratic silence. William Matthews, Jr., now a history teacher in Omaha, made his first trip to Germany in 1975. He stood on the banks of the Rhine near Remagen, trying to imagine his father's final moments. Local residents, many of whom remembered the Allied crossings, shared stories of the river's treacherous currents and hidden obstacles that had claimed other military vehicles during the war. An elderly German fisherman named Klaus Weber approached Matthews at the riverbank. Weber had been 14 in 1945 and remembered the American convoys crossing near his family's farm. He described hearing what sounded like vehicles entering the water early one morning, followed by unusual quiet. When American search boats arrived later that day, Weber's father had offered to help with local knowledge of the river's depths, but language barriers and military protocols prevented civilian assistance. Matthews documented Weber's account and shared it with other families, but military authorities dismissed it as unreliable wartime memory. The official position remained unchanged. Convoy Delta 7 had likely been swept downstream by strong currents, and the vehicles were probably buried under decades of river sediment in an unrecoverable location. In Detroit, Frank Kowalski's nephew Chester, who had become a successful businessman, hired a private investigator in 1983 to examine military records and German archives. The investigator uncovered references to unusual activity in the convoy's crossing zone during March 1945, but crucial documents were either missing or heavily redacted. The trail led to dead ends and bureaucratic roadblocks that seemed designed to prevent further inquiry. The families began to suspect that their loved one's disappearance involved more than a simple drowning accident. Perhaps the DUKWs had encountered enemy resistance that wasn't officially reported. Maybe classified cargo aboard the vehicles explained the secrecy surrounding the case, or possibly military embarrassment over operational failures had motivated a decades-long cover-up. Maria Rodriguez, now in her 80s and living in a San Antonio nursing home, spent her final years organizing her son's letters and military correspondence. She died in 1989, still believing that James's poetry journal would someday be recovered from the Rhine. Her granddaughter inherited boxes of documents that would become crucial evidence for future investigations. Now I invite you to leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested in knowing what places and at what moments of day or night these documented accounts reach. Ellen O'Brien, who had remarried and moved to California, became a vocal advocate for military transparency. She testified before congressional subcommittees on Veterans Affairs, arguing that families deserved truth, regardless of how much time had passed. Her efforts contributed to legislation requiring more extensive disclosure of wartime records, but specific information about her first husband's fate remained classified. The Cold War's end in 1991 brought hopes that previously sealed records might finally be released. Some families hired attorneys to file Freedom of Information Act requests, but responses were disappointing. Documents related to Convoy Delta 7 were either missing, destroyed, or continued to be classified for unstated reasons. As the 20th century ended, the children and grandchildren of the missing soldiers began using internet resources to share information and coordinate research. They created websites, digitized family archives, and connected with German researchers studying Rhine River archaeology. Technology was opening new possibilities for solving old mysteries, but official silence remained as impenetrable as ever. The dawn of the new millennium brought sophisticated underwater detection technology and renewed interest in wartime archaeology. David Rodriguez, grandson of the missing Private James Rodriguez, had become a marine archaeologist specializing in submerged military sites. His professional expertise gave the families their first realistic hope of locating Convoy Delta 7. In 2003, Rodriguez organized the first systematic survey of the Rhine crossing zone using side-scan sonar and magnetometry equipment. The initial results were inconclusive. The river bottom showed numerous metallic anomalies consistent with decades of debris accumulation. But the survey established baseline data and demonstrated that underwater detection in the Rhine was technically feasible. German authorities, initially resistant to foreign archaeological activities in their territorial waters, gradually became more cooperative as the historical significance of the investigation became apparent. The story of 12 missing American soldiers resonated with German researchers who had spent decades documenting their own wartime losses and civilian casualties. Dr. Ingrid Hoffmann, a maritime archaeologist from the University of Cologne, joined the search effort in 2005. Her team had developed specialized techniques for locating and documenting submerged military vehicles from World War II. She brought both technical expertise and knowledge of local river conditions that would prove essential for future discoveries. The collaboration between American families and German scientists created an international research partnership. Joint expeditions were funded through a combination of private donations, academic grants, and eventually, modest support from the U.S. Department of Defense's Missing Personnel Office. However, official enthusiasm remained limited, and bureaucratic obstacles continued to slow progress. In 2008, advanced ground-penetrating radar revealed 3 large metallic objects buried in river sediment, approximately 2 kilometers downstream from the official crossing point. The objects were consistent in size and spacing with DUKW vehicles, but confirming their identity would require extensive excavation in challenging underwater conditions. William Matthews, Jr., now approaching retirement, made multiple trips to Germany to observe the developing search efforts. He brought his own son, William III, who had become a documentary filmmaker interested in preserving family history. 3 generations of Matthews' men stood on the Rhine's banks, united by questions that had shaped their family for more than 60 years. The families established a formal non-profit organization, the Rhine River Recovery Foundation, to coordinate search activities and manage funding. They hired legal counsel to navigate international law governing underwater archaeological sites and worked with diplomatic channels to ensure proper authorization for recovery operations. Technical challenges multiplied as the investigation progressed. The Rhine's industrial traffic, environmental regulations, and seasonal flooding patterns limited access to the survey area. Each expedition required months of planning and could only operate during brief windows of favorable conditions. By 2010, high-resolution imaging had produced detailed profiles of the buried objects. Computer analysis confirmed that they matched DUKW specifications, but definitive identification required physical access to the wreckage. The families faced a critical decision: commit significant resources to full-scale excavation, or accept that technological detection might be the closest they would ever come to solving the mystery. Chester Kowalski, representing his uncle Frank's memory, argued for proceeding with excavation regardless of cost or complexity. "We've waited 65 years for answers," he told other family members during a meeting in Germany. "We owe it to them and to ourselves to see this through to the end." The path to excavation proved more treacherous than the Rhine's currents. International law governing underwater archaeological sites required permits from multiple agencies in both Germany and the United States. Military historians argued for preservation of the site as a war grave, while families insisted that recovery was necessary for closure and proper burial of remains. Dr. A. Hoffman's team submitted detailed excavation proposals to German cultural authorities in 2011, but approval was delayed by competing jurisdictional claims. The U.S. Army's Casualty Resolution Office expressed interest in the site, but questioned whether family-funded operations could meet professional archaeological standards. Bureaucratic skepticism threatened to indefinitely postpone the investigation. Legal complications multiplied when environmental groups raised concerns about disturbing river sediment that might contain wartime pollutants. The Rhine had been heavily industrialized during World War II, and buried ordnance posed additional safety risks for underwater operations. Each concern required separate impact studies and regulatory review. The families hired international law specialists to navigate the complex web of treaties, regulations, and diplomatic protocols governing the proposed excavation. Legal fees consumed significant portions of their fundraising efforts, but establishing proper authorization was essential for any future discoveries to have official recognition. In 2013, breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The German Federal Archive released previously classified documents related to Rhine crossings in 1945, including reconnaissance reports that mentioned anomalous debris patterns in the exact location where the buried objects had been detected. The archival evidence provided crucial historical context, supporting the family's theory about Convoy Delta 7's fate. American military historians, initially skeptical of family-funded research, began taking the investigation seriously as evidence accumulated. The Defense Department's POW MIA accounting agency assigned liaison officers to monitor the project and provide technical assistance. Official involvement legitimized the effort, but also introduced new layers of protocol and oversight. The families faced mounting financial pressure as legal and technical costs escalated. Fundraising efforts included social media campaigns, veterans organization donations, and contributions from German-American friendship societies. Every dollar raised brought them closer to answers, but also deeper into bureaucratic complexity that seemed designed to discourage amateur investigations. Environmental clearance finally arrived in late 2014, followed by archaeological permits in early 2015. The 70-year anniversary of Convoy Delta 7's disappearance seemed an appropriate target date for beginning excavation, but technical preparations required additional months of planning and equipment preparation. Media attention increased as the project gained official recognition. History Channel documentarians and newspaper reporters began following the family's quest, bringing public awareness to a story that had remained private for 7 decades. Publicity generated additional funding, but also attracted unwanted attention from treasure hunters and amateur archaeologists. William Matthews Jr., now in his 70s, worried that he might not live to see the excavation's results. His son, William III, documented the family's journey in a series of online videos that reached thousands of viewers worldwide. The story of Convoy Delta 7 was becoming larger than the 12 missing soldiers it began with, representing broader themes of family persistence and historical justice. Dr. Hoffman assembled an international team of underwater archaeologists, military historians, and forensic specialists for the planned excavation. Their expertise covered every aspect of the complex operation, from safely exposing buried vehicles to properly recovering and identifying human remains that had been submerged for 8 decades. If this case has already captured your attention, leave a like. This helps the 12 soldiers' story reach more people. The final bureaucratic hurdle involved establishing protocols for handling recovered remains. Military regulations required that any human remains be processed through official identification procedures before being released to families for burial. The process could take years, but families had already waited 8 decades for answers. Spring 2016 brought ideal river conditions for the long-awaited excavation. The Rhine's water level was unusually low, and mild weather provided a stable platform for the floating archaeological platform that would serve as the operation's base. Dr. Hoffman's team had rehearsed every procedure multiple times, but actual conditions at the burial site would test their preparation. The first buried object was located using underwater metal detectors, precisely where sonar imaging had predicted. Careful sediment removal revealed the distinctive angular profile of a DUKW's front end, confirming the family's theory about Convoy Delta 7's location. Decades of river silt had preserved the vehicle's basic structure, while organic materials had largely decomposed. Inside the first DUKW, archaeologists discovered military equipment, personal effects, and human remains that had been protected from river currents by the vehicle's enclosed passenger compartment. Dog tags identified the occupants as Sergeant William Matthews and Private James Rodriguez, the convoy leader and the young poet whose families had spent 70 years searching for answers. The discovery sent emotional shockwaves through both families. Sarah Matthews had died 20 years earlier, still believing her husband would someday be found, but William Jr. was present at the excavation site when his father's remains were recovered. 7 decades of questions crystallized into a single moment of terrible certainty. His father had not abandoned his family, but had died serving his country in the Rhine's dark waters. James Rodriguez's poetry journal was discovered among the debris, its leather binding preserved by river conditions that prevented complete decomposition. The pages contained his final poems about longing for home and family, written during the convoy's preparation for their fatal crossing. His granddaughter Maria wept as archaeologists carefully extracted the journal that her grandmother had dreamed of recovering. The second DUKW yielded remains of Corporal Daniel O'Brien and his 3 passengers. Personal letters, military insignia, and identification tags confirmed their identities and provided new details about the convoy's final moments. Ellen O'Brien, now 93 and living in a California care facility, received the news by telephone and whispered, "I knew he was waiting for us to find him." Technical analysis of the vehicles revealed crucial evidence about the cause of the disappearance. All 3 DUKWs showed damage consistent with structural failure rather than enemy action or collision. The amphibious vehicles had been overloaded with equipment and supplies beyond their recommended capacity, making them unstable in the Rhine's turbulent waters. Dr. Hoffman's team reconstructed the likely sequence of events. The lead DUKW had encountered difficulties in mid-river, possibly taking on water through compromised seals. The other vehicles had attempted rescue operations, but all 3 had been overwhelmed by the combination of heavy loads, strong currents, and mechanical failures that turned a routine crossing into a disaster. The excavation also uncovered evidence of the military's subsequent cover-up. Documents found in the vehicles indicated that the convoy had been carrying experimental ammunition types that were not supposed to be transported during routine river crossings. Military embarrassment over operational security failures had motivated the decision to classify the incident and discourage family inquiries. Recovery operations continued for 6 weeks as archaeologists meticulously documented every aspect of the discovery. The work attracted international media attention and academic interest from researchers studying wartime river crossings throughout Europe. Convoy Delta 7 had become a case study in both archaeological methodology and the human cost of bureaucratic silence. The families established a memorial fund to support similar search efforts for other missing military personnel. Their success with Convoy Delta 7 demonstrated that family persistence, combined with modern technology and international cooperation, could solve mysteries that official channels had abandoned decades earlier. The recovery of personal effects from the sunken DUKWs provided intimate glimpses into the soldiers' final days that no official record could have preserved. Private James Rodriguez's poetry journal contained verses written just hours before the convoy's departure, including a haunting piece titled "Crossing Waters" that seemed to foreshadow his fate. "Tomorrow we cross dark waters," Rodriguez had written, "toward a home that waits beyond the war. If these waters claim us, let them carry our letters back to those who loved us when mourning was still possible." The words, preserved in fading ink, brought his family both closure and profound sadness for dreams that would never be realized. Sergeant William Matthews had been carrying a photograph of his pregnant wife Sarah, along with a half-finished letter describing his hopes for their unborn child. "The baby will be born in May," he had written, "and I dream of teaching him to fish in the creek behind our house, where the water runs clear and peaceful, nothing like these troubled European rivers that have seen too much war." The personal effects revealed the soldiers' humanity in ways that military records never could. Private Michael Thompson had been saving German coins as souvenirs for his younger brother back in Iowa. Corporal Daniel O'Brien carried rosary beads and a worn prayer book that his Irish grandmother had given him before deployment. Each item told a story of interrupted lives and unfulfilled promises. Dr. Hoffman's forensic analysis revealed additional details about the convoy's final moments. The positioning of remains within the vehicles suggested that some soldiers had survived the initial sinking and had attempted to escape through emergency exits. Their bodies were found near windows and hatches, indicating desperate struggles against rising water and mechanical failures. The military equipment recovered from the DUKWs included the experimental ammunition that had been classified for 70 years. Technical evaluation by ordnance specialists revealed that the convoy had been transporting prototype shells designed for new artillery systems being tested in the war's final months. The ammunition's weight and hazardous nature explained why military authorities had been reluctant to acknowledge the convoy's true mission. Testimony from surviving members of the 89th Infantry Division, now in their 90s, provided additional context for the discovery. Several veterans remembered being briefed about special cargo missions that required enhanced security protocols. They had been ordered not to discuss convoy operations with family members or in personal correspondence, explaining the unusual silence surrounding Delta 7's disappearance. The soldiers' families learned that their loved ones had been part of an experimental program testing new logistics approaches for the invasion of Japan, which was planned for late 1945. The Rhine crossing had been a rehearsal for amphibious operations in the Pacific, making the convoy's loss more significant from a strategic perspective than routine supply missions. William Matthews III's documentary about the discovery premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 2017, bringing the Convoy Delta 7 story to audiences worldwide. The film combined family interviews, archaeological footage, and historical analysis to explore themes of loss, persistence, and the human cost of military secrecy. Critics praised its sensitive treatment of both personal grief and historical complexity. The documentary's success generated additional research into similar wartime disappearances. Families of missing soldiers from other conflicts contacted the Rhine River Recovery Foundation, seeking assistance with their own searches. The Convoy Delta 7 case had become a template for civilian-initiated military archaeology projects. German audiences were particularly moved by the story's international cooperation aspects. The successful partnership between American families and German researchers demonstrated how former enemies could work together to heal historical wounds and honor the memory of all who died in wartime, regardless of their nationality. Educational initiatives emerged from the discovery, with schools in both Germany and the United States incorporating the Convoy Delta 7 story into curricula about World War II. Students learned not only about the war's major battles and political decisions, but also about individual soldiers who disappeared into history and the families who refused to let them be forgotten. The archaeological methodology developed for the Rhine excavation was adopted by other underwater military sites throughout Europe. Dr. Hoffman's techniques for preserving submerged remains and artifacts became standard practices for maritime military archaeology. ensuring that future discoveries would be handled with the same care and scientific rigor. The formal identification process for the recovered remains took 18 months, as military forensic specialists used DNA analysis, dental records, and personal effects to confirm the identity of each soldier. Families provided biological samples and historical documentation to support the scientific identification procedures that would finally bring their loved ones home after 73 years of uncertainty. During this agonizing waiting period, newly declassified military documents revealed the full extent of the cover-up that had hidden Convoy Delta 7's true fate for 7 decades. Internal communications showed that division commanders had immediately recognized the convoy's loss as a significant operational failure that could undermine confidence in amphibious crossing procedures and expose dangerous lapses in military judgment. General Maxwell Harrison, the division commander in 1945, had personally ordered the classification of all documents related to the incident within hours of the convoy's disappearance. His private correspondence, discovered in military archives decades later, revealed deep concerns that public knowledge of the experimental ammunition transport would compromise other special operations and damage civilian morale during the war's crucial final months. The general's decision was influenced by the convoy's unofficial mission, transporting prototype artillery shells that had never been tested in combat conditions. The experimental ammunition was part of a classified program developing new weapons for the planned invasion of Japan, scheduled for late 1945. Military leaders feared that revealing the convoy's true cargo would expose strategic plans to enemy intelligence services. But the classification decision created a cascade of deception that would haunt 12 families for generations. Staff officers were ordered to destroy operational logs, radio transcripts, and witness statements that could have helped families understand their loved ones' fate. The official incident report, filed 3 days after the disappearance, contained deliberate omissions and factual inaccuracies designed to obscure the convoy's true mission. The decision to classify the convoy's disappearance had been reinforced by Cold War security concerns throughout the 1950s and beyond. Military intelligence agencies worried that Soviet espionage services might learn about experimental weapons programs through families seeking information about missing soldiers. National security became the perpetual justification for maintaining decades of silence about what was essentially a tragic training accident. CIA documents released in 2017 revealed that foreign intelligence services had already obtained detailed information about American experimental weapons programs through other sources, making the continued classification of Convoy Delta 7 files unnecessary from a security perspective. The families had been denied truth to protect secrets that were no longer secret, their grief prolonged to serve bureaucratic convenience rather than national interests. Family correspondence files, preserved by military clerks for 70 years, showed the devastating human cost of institutional secrecy. Hundreds of letters from wives, mothers, and children pleading for information had been filed away with standardized form responses that revealed nothing about ongoing investigations or discoveries. The military bureaucracy had developed elaborate procedures for saying nothing while appearing to care about families' concerns. The most damaging revelation came from a 1953 internal memo recommending that Convoy Delta 7 files be permanently sealed to prevent unnecessary civilian distress and potential security complications. The memo's author, Colonel Robert Caldwell, argued that acknowledging the convoy's recovery would require explaining why the search had been abandoned so quickly, potentially exposing military negligence and operational security failures. Military officials had concluded that maintaining silence was preferable to acknowledging their role in a preventable tragedy that had killed 12 soldiers and devastated their families. They possessed detailed knowledge of the convoy's likely location from 1947 onwards, when German fishermen reported debris consistent with military vehicles in the exact area where the DUKWs were eventually discovered 70 years later. William Matthews, Jr., for now 73 years old, testified before a congressional subcommittee investigating military transparency practices. His voice trembled with controlled anger as he described 7 decades of official deception that had prevented his family from properly grieving his father's death. They knew where he was, Matthews told the assembled lawmakers. They knew what happened to him and his men. They chose silence over truth, institutional protection over human decency. The families filed a comprehensive class action lawsuit against the Department of Defense, seeking compensation for emotional distress caused by the prolonged concealment of information about their relatives' deaths. Legal proceedings revealed additional evidence of systematic efforts to prevent family access to information that could have led to earlier recovery of remains and proper burial decades earlier. Discovery motions in the lawsuit uncovered a 1961 military study that had identified the exact location of Convoy Delta 7's wreckage using early sonar technology. The study recommended recovery operations, but Pentagon officials rejected the proposal, citing budget constraints and minimal strategic value. 12 families had continued their desperate search, while government officials possessed precise coordinates of their loved ones' resting place. Media investigations inspired by the Convoy Delta 7 case exposed similar patterns of institutional deception affecting hundreds of other military families. Investigative journalists discovered systematic efforts to classify information about wartime disappearances that official records showed had been solved decades earlier, creating a hidden archive of resolved cases that families were never told about. The scandal prompted congressional hearings that revealed widespread problems with military casualty notification procedures and family communication protocols. Witnesses testified about receiving contradictory information, being denied access to investigation files, and facing bureaucratic obstacles designed to discourage persistent inquiries about missing service members. Dr. Hoffman's final archaeological report, published in the prestigious Journal of Military History, documented not only the technical aspects of the excavation, but also the ethical implications of archaeological research that challenges official narratives. Her work established new international standards for transparency and family involvement in military archaeological projects, emphasizing that historical truth should not be subordinated to institutional convenience. The recovered experimental ammunition from the DUKWs was finally declassified and displayed in the National World War II Museum's newest exhibit, with comprehensive explanatory materials acknowledging the convoy's true mission and the tragedy that resulted from operational overreach and subsequent cover-up. The exhibit became both a memorial to the 12 soldiers and a powerful reminder that government secrecy often serves bureaucratic interests rather than national security. Congressional hearings resulted in landmark legislation requiring systematic review of classified military files more than 50 years old, with legal presumptions favoring declassification unless specific, demonstrable national security concerns could be articulated and defended. The law was informally known as the Convoy Delta 7 Transparency Act, in recognition of the case that had prompted its passage and the families whose persistence had exposed decades of institutional deception. On November 11, 2018, Veterans Day, the remains of all 12 soldiers from Convoy Delta 7 were interred in Arlington National Cemetery during a ceremony that honored both their wartime service and their families' extraordinary persistence in bringing them home. The burial had been 73 years in the making, representing one of the longest quests for military accountability in American history. Sarah Matthews had died in 1998, 20 years before her husband's remains were recovered, but she had left detailed instructions for his burial service that reflected a lifetime of unwavering faith that he would eventually come home. William Matthews, Jr. read from her final letter with tears streaming down his weathered face. "When Billy comes home, tell him that his son grew up to be a good man, that his grandson carries his name with pride, and that every day of our lives we carried him in our hearts, even when the government tried to make us forget him." The ceremony drew hundreds of attendees, including surviving World War II veterans, family members spanning 4 generations, German researchers who had assisted with the discovery, and military officials who publicly acknowledged the institutional failures that had prolonged the family's suffering. The presence of high-ranking Pentagon officials represented an unprecedented admission of government responsibility for the decades of silence and deception. Arlington's military chaplains conducted interfaith services reflecting the diverse religious backgrounds of the 12 soldiers. Father Michael Sullivan blessed the remains of Catholic soldiers Daniel O'Brien and Anthony Ricci, while Rabbi David Goldstein offered prayers for Samuel Jackson, whose Jewish faith had been documented in his recovered personal effects. Military protocols were adapted to honor each soldier's individual beliefs, while maintaining the ceremony's unified commemorative purpose. The honor guard consisted of active duty soldiers from the modern successor unit to the 89th Infantry Division, symbolically completing the military brotherhood that had been broken by the Rhine River crossing in 1945. As they carried each flag-draped coffin to its final resting place, the soldiers moved with precise measured steps that seemed to acknowledge the weight of delayed justice finally being served. Dr. Ingrid Hoffmann delivered a eulogy that was simultaneously a historical account and a meditation on the meaning of memory. These 12 men died serving their country in 1945, she said, but they were lost to bureaucratic silence for 73 years. Today we restore them not only to the earth, but to the historical record they always deserved to occupy. Their families' persistence has given them back their names, their stories, and their rightful place in our collective memory. The German ambassador to the United States, Dr. Klaus Weber, son of the fisherman who had tried to help with the original search in 1945, presented each family with a memorial volume containing photographs and historical documentation of the Rhine crossing site. His presence symbolized the international cooperation that had made the discovery possible and the transformation of former enemies into partners in honoring shared wartime sacrifice. William Matthews III premiered a documentary short film during the burial ceremony, featuring interviews with family members, archival footage of World War II Rhine crossings, and underwater footage from the archaeological excavation. The film's final scene showed all 12 soldiers' names being engraved on Arlington's memorial walls, visually representing their restoration to official recognition after decades of bureaucratic erasure. James Rodriguez's recovered poetry journal was placed in a specially designed memorial case that would be displayed permanently at the National Archives, ensuring that future researchers and visitors could read his final verses about longing for home and family. His granddaughter Maria donated additional family documents to create a comprehensive archive of the search effort that had consumed 4 generations of relatives. The congressional delegation attending the ceremony included representatives who had sponsored the transparency legislation inspired by the Convoy Delta 7 case. Senator Elizabeth Warren, speaking on behalf of the families, declared that these 12 soldiers died twice, once in the Rhine River in 1945 and again in the classified files that buried their memory. Today, we resurrect not only their remains, but our commitment to treating military families with the honesty and respect they deserve. Following the formal burial service, family members gathered at a private reception where they shared photographs, letters, and memories that had sustained them through 7 decades of uncertainty. Children and grandchildren, who had grown up knowing their relatives only through stories and photographs, finally had graves to visit, and a confirmed narrative of heroism and sacrifice rather than mysterious disappearance. The reception featured a special presentation by military historians who had researched the broader context of Convoy Delta 7's mission. They revealed that the experimental ammunition the soldiers had been transporting was part of the Manhattan Project's conventional weapons development program designed to support the invasion of Japan if atomic weapons proved insufficient to end the war. The convoy's sacrifice had been part of preparations for battles that never had to be fought. Chester Kowalski, representing his uncle Frank's memory, announced the establishment of a scholarship fund for descendants of military personnel who had been denied information about missing relatives. The fund would support legal education and historical research, ensuring that future families would have resources to challenge institutional secrecy and demand accountability from government agencies. The Rhine River Recovery Foundation, which had coordinated the search effort, announced plans to assist other families seeking information about wartime disappearances. Their success with Convoy Delta 7 had demonstrated that civilian persistence, combined with modern technology and international cooperation, could solve mysteries that official channels had abandoned or deliberately concealed. As the ceremony concluded, a military bugler played taps while 12 white doves were released into the November sky, each representing one of the soldiers who had finally completed their journey home. The symbolism was not lost on attendees. These men had been liberated not by military action, but by their families' refusal to accept silence as an answer to their questions. The burial of Convoy Delta 7 became a watershed moment for military transparency advocates and families of missing service members worldwide. Their story proved that institutional secrecy could be overcome by persistent civilian action, that historical truth could emerge even after decades of official denial, and that the bond between soldiers and their families transcends death, time, and bureaucratic obstruction. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of Convoy Delta 7. We'll see you in the next video.